Before dawn on June 6, 1944, the English Channel was alive with sound. The distant hum of thousands of engines rolled across the cold water, a mechanical heartbeat of history about to unfold. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the largest armada the world had ever seen was moving steadily toward France. On the gray beaches of Normandy, German sentries peered into the mist, unaware that the storm they'd feared for months had finally arrived. For months, German propaganda had promised the Atlantic Wall was impenetrable, a fortress stretching from Norway to Spain, defended by concrete, mines, and machine guns. But inside the bunkers and pillboxes, many soldiers knew better. The veterans of the Eastern Front, transferred west, saw the cracks in the system, weak logistics, insufficient supplies, and a dangerous overconfidence from Berlin. The younger conscripts, barely out of school, followed orders but whispered doubts. Still, no one imagined the scale of what was coming. The night had been restless. The Luftwaffe was grounded, skies dominated by Allied aircraft. Radio chatter was silent, orders confused. Even as paratroopers dropped behind their lines, the German command hesitated, uncertain whether this was the real invasion or a diversion for Calais. That hesitation, those critical hours of disbelief, would shape the fate of Europe. At 5:30 a.m., the first Allied naval shells screamed toward the coast. The roar was deafening. Beaches like Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword erupted in fire and steel. German soldiers scrambled to their positions, clutching MG-42s, ears ringing, hearts pounding. Many had never seen such overwhelming force. It wasn't just a landing, it was a tidal wave of men, machines, and determination. In a bunker near Omaha Beach, Lieutenant Heinrich Brandt, a 26-year-old officer, later recalled, "We couldn't see the sea, only smoke. Everything shook. The ground, the walls, our own hands, and when the fog lifted, it looked like the horizon itself was moving, ships everywhere. We didn't understand how many there were until the first wave came. Then we understood too late. For the defenders, time dissolved into chaos. Communication lines were cut, artillery units isolated, commanders frantically calling for reinforcements that never came. Those stationed near Caen and Bayeux waited for orders from higher command. But in the Shattucks and field headquarters miles inland, the senior officers were asleep or arguing over false reports of an invasion at Calais. Rommel, the desert fox himself, was not even there. He was in Germany visiting his wife for her birthday, a decision made in confidence that no invasion would come under such rough weather. By the time he returned, the beaches were lost. The Allied soldiers, meanwhile, faced their own kind of hell. Landing craft opened to torrents of bullets. Many never made it past the surf, but they kept coming, wave after wave, until sheer persistence overcame the German fortifications. What the defenders had believed was an unbreakable wall was now cracking under the weight of history itself. For many German soldiers, the shock wasn't only military, it was existential. The war they'd been told was righteous now seemed doomed. The leadership that claimed invincibility had miscalculated. And as the Allies pushed inland, the realization spread. The Reich was no longer advancing, it was defending, and losing. Still, amidst the chaos, courage flickered on both sides. German medics risked their lives, dragging wounded comrades through burning trenches. Allied engineers cleared mines under fire to open beach exits. It was war at its most human and most brutal, a collision not just of armies, but of convictions and fears. By nightfall, the beaches of Normandy were secured. The cost was staggering, tens of thousands of dead and wounded on both sides. Yet for Germany, this day marked something more than a defeat. It was the beginning of the end. The myth of invincibility had been shattered. And deep inside that crumbling illusion, doubt began to grow, doubt that would, in the months ahead, erode the very foundation of the Third Reich. By the afternoon of June 6th, the full scale of the invasion began to sink in. The beaches burned with smoke and wreckage, and the German officers who had once spoken confidently of driving the enemy into the sea were now issuing frantic, contradictory orders. Telephones rang unanswered. Radio channels jammed with panic. In coastal command posts, maps became meaningless. Units that existed on paper no longer existed in the field. A regiment listed as holding position might have been annihilated hours ago. Reinforcements were requested, redirected, or lost entirely in the chaos of Allied airstrikes. What Germany had built as a wall had in reality been a patchwork, strong in theory, fragile in execution. At 10:00 a.m., word finally reached the high command in Paris that the Normandy landings were not a diversion. Yet Hitler refused to release the armored divisions stationed near Calais. The deception campaign known as Operation Fortitude, with fake armies, dummy tanks, and false radio traffic, had worked perfectly. Hitler was convinced that the real invasion was still coming elsewhere. So while Allied troops secured their beachheads and pushed inland, Germany's most powerful panzer divisions sat idle, waiting for orders that would never come in time. When Rommel received the news of the invasion, he was more furious than surprised. For months, he had warned Berlin that the Atlantic Wall was overstated, that Allied air superiority would make any counterattack nearly impossible. But few had listened. Now, as he raced back to France, he saw with his own eyes the truth he had feared. Roads clogged with wrecked vehicles, convoys bombed to ashes, and demoralized soldiers retreating without orders. In his car, Rommel dictated a report. "The Allied landing has succeeded beyond expectation. Our front is broken. Unless the Führer acts immediately, the war in the West will be lost within weeks." But immediately meant nothing in Hitler's headquarters. The Führer had slept late that day. No one dared wake him. Only in the late morning did his staff bring him the news, by which time the Allies had already secured several landing zones. Hitler's reaction was disbelief, then rage, and finally paralysis. He oscillated between promising a crushing counterattack and blaming his generals for betrayal. Meanwhile, on the beaches and hedgerows, the German soldiers fought with grim determination. In places like Omaha, the resistance was fierce and devastating. Entire Allied units were pinned down for hours, the sand red with blood. Yet as the day went on, the defenders began to realize the futility of their effort. They could slow the tide, but they could not stop it. In one battered pillbox overlooking Juno Beach, a wounded German sergeant named Otto Weber watched as British and Canadian troops advanced across the dunes. His ammunition was nearly gone, his comrades dead or scattered. In a letter later found on his body, he had written, "We are holding, but not for long. They are everywhere in the air, on the sea, in our hearts. It feels as if the world itself has turned against us." That sentiment echoed across the front. For many Germans, Normandy was not just a military failure, it was a psychological one. The illusion of control shattered. The war that had once promised victory and glory now revealed only inevitability. By nightfall, German reinforcements tried to move toward the front, but the skies belonged entirely to the Allies. Fighter bombers, Typhoons, Mustangs, Thunderbolts strafed every road and bridge. Entire panzer columns were destroyed before reaching Normandy. The soldiers who survived often abandoned their vehicles, walking through forests in silence, avoiding the sky. Rommel arrived at the front on June 7th, exhausted but resolute. He moved from unit to unit, urging men to hold their ground. His presence lifted morale, but even he could see that the situation was collapsing faster than reports suggested. The once proud army of the Reich was now fractured, divided between fanatical SS commanders determined to die for Hitler and weary Wehrmacht officers who saw the war as lost. In every field and farmhouse, the same unspoken question lingered: was it still worth fighting for? In Berlin, propaganda continued to speak of heroic resistance, but the truth filtered through the letters home. Soldiers wrote not of victory, but of survival, not of destiny, but of doubt. The front line had become a place of reckoning. For many, Normandy was the moment they realized the Reich's promises had been lies. The thousand-year empire was cracking after barely 12. The Atlantic Wall had fallen in a single day. And in that collapse, something profound shifted, a recognition that history was changing direction, that Germany's power, once unchallenged, was being swept away by the relentless tide of Allied unity and industrial might. By June 10th, the Allies had linked several beachheads, establishing a firm front. The Germans, now fully aware of the disaster, began pulling reserves from other parts of Europe. Yet each counterattack failed, crushed under overwhelming air power and artillery. As Rommel inspected the ruins of a destroyed panzer division near Villers-Bocage, he turned to his aide and said quietly, "The war cannot be won now. We can only try to end it before Germany itself is destroyed." Those words, spoken not by a deserter, but by one of Germany's most respected generals, marked the moment when even the architects of conquest began to understand the truth. Normandy was not just an invasion. It was an awakening for the world and for Germany itself. By mid-June 1944, the beaches of Normandy were no longer the front, they were the rear. The fighting had moved inland into a maze of hedgerows, villages, and open fields that turned every mile into a blood-soaked struggle. The German army, fragmented and exhausted, fought with what strength it had left. They had no air cover, limited fuel, and dwindling ammunition. Yet they fought on partly out of duty, partly out of fear, and partly because they knew there was no way back. Each sunrise brought the drone of Allied aircraft overhead. Columns that moved by day were destroyed by noon. Bridges disappeared overnight. Supply lines vanished. What once had been a disciplined military machine was now reduced to scattered groups of soldiers, cut off and improvising for survival. The Allies pressed relentlessly forward, British and Canadians toward Caen, Americans breaking out from the bocage near Saint-Lô. The German defenses, stretched thin, began to buckle. Panzer divisions were thrown in piecemeal, often arriving too late or too broken to matter. Among the German ranks, whispers spread not just of defeat but of betrayal. Soldiers blamed the generals, generals blamed Berlin, and Berlin, trapped in its own delusions, blamed everyone but itself. In Hitler's headquarters at the Wolf's Lair, news from Normandy arrived like a constant drumbeat of disaster. Each report grew worse. Hitler refused to accept the truth. He issued orders to hold ground to the last man, even when the situation made it impossible. Commanders who retreated to save their men were accused of cowardice or treason. Some were executed. Rommel, now certain that the war was lost, began quietly reaching out to other officers who believed Germany's only hope was to end the fighting, to overthrow Hitler himself. The conspiracy that would later culminate in the July 20th plot was already forming in his mind. He wrote in his notes, "If we do not act, Germany will be buried beneath the ruins of its own pride." But even as these thoughts took shape, the front continued to collapse. The Allied armies, bolstered by endless supplies and air power, broke through at Saint-Lô in early July. Operation Cobra shattered what remained of the German line. Thousands of soldiers were killed or captured in days. Towns that had held out for weeks fell overnight. The German commanders on the ground began to realize that the war had passed beyond their control. They were no longer fighting for victory, only for time. Each withdrawal was described in reports as tactical, but everyone knew it meant retreat. As the Allies advanced, German soldiers found themselves cut off in pockets. Some surrendered willingly, raising white flags from barns and cellars. Others fought until their ammunition ran out. A few chose death over capture, still clinging to the oaths they had sworn years before. The civilians of Normandy paid the price. Bombed towns, burned fields, and unburied dead marked the countryside. German soldiers who had once believed they were liberators of Europe now watched in silence as the people they occupied cheered their defeat. Letters from home made the despair worse. Cities in Germany were being flattened by Allied bombers. Families were fleeing to the countryside. Food was scarce. Faith in victory had become a hollow echo. A German lieutenant wrote in his diary near Falaise, "We are ghosts now. Every step forward feels like walking into history's judgment. No one believes in victory anymore, only in survival." By August 1944, the Allies had trapped much of the German 7th Army in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. The slaughter was unimaginable. Roads were littered with wrecked vehicles, dead horses, and burned-out tanks. The smell of death hung over the fields for weeks. When the pocket finally closed, more than 10,000 German soldiers lay dead and another 50,000 were captured. It was the end of German resistance in Normandy. The survivors who escaped retreated toward the Seine, broken and beaten. Rommel never made it that far. His car was strafed by Allied aircraft on July 17th. Badly wounded, he was taken home to recover. In October, accused of treason in the July 20th plot, he was forced to take his own life. For many, his fate symbolized the tragic end of a nation led astray, a man who had fought with honor, caught in a web of madness he could no longer control. As the Allies liberated Paris in August 1944, the magnitude of what had begun on June 6th was finally clear. The storm that had broken upon Normandy had become a hurricane sweeping across Europe. The German army, once feared, disciplined, and proud, was now in full retreat. And yet, amid defeat, there were moments of humanity. German medics treated Allied prisoners with compassion. Civilians hid deserters to spare them from execution. Even in ruin, fragments of conscience survived. When historians look back on Normandy, they often see it as a triumph of strategy and courage, and it was. But for Germany, it was something deeper, a reckoning. The day the war turned was also the day the myth died. The illusion of invincibility, the blind faith in leadership, the belief in destiny, all were swept away by the storm that arrived from the sea. In the end, the lesson of Normandy was not just military, it was moral. Power built on deception cannot last. Conviction without truth collapses when tested by reality. And when a nation chooses pride over humanity, the cost is always measured in lives. As the camera pulls back over the wrecked beaches and the endless rows of white crosses that mark the dead, the narrator's voice fades softly. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the world changed. The tide that came ashore at Normandy carried not just soldiers, but the weight of freedom and the judgment of history. For Germany, it was the beginning of the end. For the world, it was the beginning of deliverance.